Hello and welcome to our Syxsense May Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and Rob will reach out after to answer those. And with that, I'll pass things over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. We really appreciate the time that you spend over the next 30 minutes with us to go over Patch Tuesday. I have some really important details today about Patch Tuesday. It returns to normal. If you remember, last month we had the largest Patch Tuesday that ever was, and we kind of returned back to normal. I know that has been a very, very busy month for a lot of our customers. To start off with, we have some end-of-life news. We are going to continue these until all of our customers have upgraded to a supported operating system. If it's your first time here, Windows 10 Enterprise goes end of life next year. That is 2025. Microsoft is recommending going to Windows 11, of course. We don't have an official release date for Windows 12 yet, and we certainly haven't tested it internally, but you must make sure that you have made plans or are making plans to upgrade to Windows 11 because that will sneak up really, really fast. For Windows Server 2012, we have ESU extensions. I believe we're in year 2 right now. That is actually going to be end of life on the 10th of October 2026. And just because it's Windows 11, it's also going end of life in 2026 as well. That's for the feature update 23 H2. We do expect there to be plenty more feature updates for Windows 11, and because you have a 30-month gap between feature updates, that actually gives you 30 months at least support for that feature update. Usually our customers spend about 6 months upgrading all of their devices to the latest version of a feature update, and that gives them then at least a year and a half with that feature update version. Now you will need to make sure you keep up to date with the feature updates because patching is dependent upon it. So if your feature updates go end of life, there will be no further patches for that update. Now, everything I've just mentioned does not include the long-term servicing branch, and I believe that actually has a life expectancy all the way to 2030. So if you are in a long-term servicing branch, well done. You won't have to worry about upgrading your operating system for an awful long time. Now, we also have a Google 0-day. I think this is probably the 5th one, certainly less than we had last year. This is kind of interesting, actually. So they came out with this 0-day weaponized vulnerability. They don't usually release details about their 0-day vulnerability, but this time they actually did. So CVE 2024-4671, which is Google Chrome 1240.6367.201. This was released on the 10th of May. This is actually fixing an issue with Chrome's visual component. Now, I want to remember that because there are 2 Microsoft updates coming up that actually meets almost the exact same description. But since Google usually says that they will release details after everyone has already installed it, it's very interesting that they've released this information at the same time as the patch. So please, if you're using Google Chrome browser, please make sure that these get updated. If you're a Syxsense customer, Google Chrome is available for immediate deployment. It does not require Google to be closed and reopened. We are actually able to update Google in situ, or what we call in place. So the binaries on the PC will be upgraded even if Google is open. And we have a special guest to the webinar today. I actually decided to take some time on the CISA website, and I found something super interesting. Now, they don't usually add these types of vulnerability details, but there is actually an active exploit apparently coming from the Russian Federation, specifically targeting this old vulnerability, CVE 2022-38028. Now, this was the Windows Print Spooler vulnerability that I think we called it Print Nightmare, because it was a patch that they released to fix a printing issue that broke a whole bunch of stuff, and they released a patch to fix that, and then they released a patch to fix that. So it's kind of 3 patches to resolve the vulnerability. What is interesting, though, I'm kind of curious how many of our customers are actually requiring the print spooler to be available. So a lot of software that we're using now has its own printer capability. So you might want to do software printing to a PDF, for example, and that doesn't actually require a print spooler at all. If you're printing from the Google Cloud architecture, that actually doesn't use a print spooler either. So the question is, are you printing? And if you are printing, do you need your print spooler service running? If the print spooler service is not running, you can reduce your attack surface, especially if it is not necessary. You may not need to disable it necessarily, but you can certainly put the print spooler service into a non-running state, and that potentially will reduce any risk you have from any further exploits, especially since some of the older vulnerabilities, which I would hope everyone watching today has already taken care of this update. But potentially, if the print spooler is an attack vector, and you absolutely do not need the print spooler for your day-to-day operation, then potentially you might want to create use a Cortex workflow to go ahead and stop the print spooler service, and that should reduce your the potential of attack in the future. Now, Patch Tuesday, back to its usual cadence. As I said, 58 updates from 147 last month. 10 are more likely to be weaponized. 2 actually were. There was actually a late re-release yesterday of Patch Tuesday. So they released their first set of data that said that there was 1 weaponization, and then actually about a half an hour later marked one of the others weaponized as well, which we caught. One of those that is weaponized is also public aware, and I'll go into more detail about what they mean in a second. And also 4 of those vulnerabilities have jump points, and they're very, very serious. So here on the webcast, we like to talk about how you might prioritize them, even if you're not a Syxsense customer. And there are definitely different ways of doing it based on what I call your patch risk. So whatever is your patch risk, you can set that up to make sure that the patches that meet that risk can be included in your rollout, depending how many devices, how many countries you have those devices, and the types of networks you have in your organization. There's definitely a strategy for everybody, and it can be in deployment zones, so you can deploy the most critical, followed by the next most critical, etc., etc. And we're going to cover a few of those ideas today. Now, the bug types. This is also back to usual. We have remote code execution. We had 25 of those. Those are the most serious. That's a class of cyber attack in which an attacker can remotely execute commands or place malware or other malicious software on your computer or network. Elevation of privilege is a threat actor that gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. That was 17 of those. We have security feature bypass. There's only 2 of those, which actually is to bypass authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. Information disclosure, 7 of those, when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. 3 denial of service, and 3 spoofing vulnerabilities, very similar to each other. Actually, they're not similar to each other. Denial of service is an attack that's meant to shut down a machine or a network, making it inaccessible, and a spoofing is the act of disguise. Now, there's actually one more vulnerability on this list, which actually was highlighted to me by one of my team members, which is a tampering vulnerability. That one is very similar to the spoofing, and that's basically trying to make the call that you're making to look like something else. there's also one of those that is resolved in this list. So the most serious is remote code execution vulnerability. Now, because it's the most serious, if you have to make a choice and you are not able to deploy all of the vulnerabilities, that may be one identifying vector that you will use to choose the updates to deploy to your environment. Remote execution, they are the most serious, as I said, and there's an awful lot of vulnerabilities that are fixed with those updates. Now, also, this is how we recommend you prioritize patching if you're a Syxsense customer. If you're actually not a Syxsense customer, you can also use this. We balance everything on our website so that you can make the most informed decisions based on your exposure. But we call this the Syx score. It's 6 factors that help you make a decision about what you're going to deploy and how urgently you're going to deploy it. Starts off with the vendor severity. Now, the vendor severity is critical, high, important, medium and low, and NA, and that's obviously going from the most critical to the least critical. Now, not all vendors call their severities all the same. That's why I mentioned high and important. Sometimes there is slight differences, but actually it is important that you factor that in to your decision making so that you make sure you've got that selected. Now, some vendors, some we know are very, very popular, will sometimes downplay their severity. That is why we have the CVSS score in addition to the vendor severity. The CVSS score is a score out of 10. It's independently calculated by NIST for us and everyone else. Actually, it's totally transparent, has a calculator that they input the vulnerability, the method to expose, how likely it is to be exposed, etc. And they come out with a score out of 10. Based on that, you can balance the severity of your cost too, and it will help you have a more transparent selection of the severity of a particular patch. Now, the weaponization is also called exploitable, and that means there is a actual exploit somewhere in the world, and we have a large database. We have a partnership with many antivirus companies and Microsoft that are helping us know that certain patches, certain CVEs are being used in an active exploit. When we find that, we actually update your console automatically, and that might be another selection of its own that you want to use to target devices that are detected with weaponized vulnerabilities and have them installed on a far faster cadence. So maybe you'll have devices checking every 6 hours for any vulnerability that is weaponized and automatically install it. Public aware, however, doesn't mean it's weaponized. Public aware means somebody, very kindly, a white hat hacker, for example, has published onto their YouTube channel or onto a bug bounty website that a very specific CVE can be exploited, and they've provided the details, i.e. the blueprint to actually exploit it. Now, there are an awful lot of these, and not all of these are then weaponized. But I certainly wouldn't want to be an IT manager that knew something was public aware, wasn't yet weaponized, and didn't target it, because sometimes the distance in time between public and weaponized can be very short. And so depending on that, you may also want to factor that in to the selection process. Now, to balance it, we have countermeasures. Now, countermeasures are either one of two things. One, you have a mitigation, and that means you don't actually need to deploy it. You have a next generation antivirus, or you have a certain setting on your device, or you don't have the software configured. In that case, you have a mitigation. You do not need to apply the update. Then you've got workarounds. So workarounds may be something that you can apply via group policy or via Syxsense that actually gives you time to roll out the update that actually solves the problem. So although you may have a countermeasure on this vulnerability, and if all of the other factors are exactly the same, one vulnerability will be higher in risk than the other. Countermeasures do allow you to deploy something out to the devices much, much quicker, especially if you consider some of these updates are 1.5 gigabytes in size. And we can't just throw out a 1.5 gigabyte patch across a highly distributed customer of ours. So we have to do it in stages. We certainly won't want to cause any end user disruption. So we can apply the countermeasures to give us a bit of time. Now, of course, all of that has to consider your exposure. A certain vulnerability that is maybe high in severity, weaponized on 5% of your estate versus a critical vulnerability that's weaponized with no countermeasure that is on 85% of your estate should probably take priority. So you factor everything in with your exposure, and that gives you the vulnerabilities which you should care about, i.e. your patch risk profile. So the patch risk profile could be these 6 factors. It can also factor in things like independent weaponization, and it also can factor in the type of bug as well. And that gives you a list of updates that are really important to you, and those are the ones that you can deploy first. Now, what are you actually going to deploy first, you're asking? So let's go take a look at our website. So on our website, Syxsense.com, going to bring that across here. We actually did publish this yesterday, and we do publish that the day before this webinar. So do feel free to check the website out. If you have any questions about joining this Patch Tuesday webinar next month or any of our other Patch Tuesday webinars, use this chat function in the corner. Our colleagues would love to talk to you. If you have any questions around patching strategy, patch testing, things like that, there is a really cool resources section up here where you can download our white papers that cover all of that. We have an events section, which has all of our other events that we're running. If you like this webinar, or if you're a regular, thank you for rejoining us today. I am co-hosting another webinar next week, actually, from RSA. Love to see you join us. Co-hosting with a colleague of mine. She's fantastic, super clever, and we're going to be talking about what we learned about RSA last week. So if you have an hour next week, it'd be lovely to see you there. Also, under the resources section, you've got our Patch Tuesday links, and this is it. So like I said, 58 updates was fixed in Patch Tuesday yesterday. Quite small, but still very important. What did we learn? Well, 2 of those, as I mentioned, was weaponized, which actually carried only an important severity. So that's why it's so important that you have multiple factors in the selection process. If you're only deploying criticals, those 2 weaponized threats would not have made it in your selection process. We had updates for Windows, Windows components, we had Office, Azure, .NET Framework, Visual Studio, Power BI, and Intune. It's not in there because I know a lot of Intune, I think, has its own update capability, but there was an update for Intune. So if you are an Intune customer, please make sure you apply that update. If you count all of the CVSSs up, we get a total of 419.8. I like to do this from time to time because it helps me understand how serious a particular group of updates from Microsoft is. The average score was 7.2, which is actually way down from last month, which was 7.6. So what this tells me is there's half the number of updates. There's quite a lot of very serious ones, but nothing absolutely massive to worry about. I do have a couple of recommendations, and here's the nicest part of this webinar. I get to learn about parts of Windows that I don't know, and potentially if I don't know, you won't know them either. So I'm going to actually use this as a bit of an education as well. So my first selection is CVE 2024-30051. Now this is a Windows DMW core library elevation of privilege. You might say, Rob, what is Windows DWM? Well, it stands for Desktop Windows Manager, and that was introduced in Windows Vista, and it's actually the way that the screen appears to you from the software. Kind of interesting. That sounds a bit like the Google Chrome, but actually there's more. The old days, the old monitors used to run pixels, and the pixels used to change colors, and that's actually how you saw the screen. And the new desktop manager actually is utilizing the graphics memory on your graphics card, and it's actually presenting real pictures to the screen. And so this particular vulnerability is actually intersecting between the operating system and the graphics to display on your screen. It's very, very serious. This is one of the weaponized and public aware vulnerabilities in the list. Now, an attacker who exploits this could gain system privileges. Very, very serious. There's no countermeasure. Now, the risk, you have to be local to the device, so you have to have access to the local LAN, but it does have a low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and luckily it doesn't have a jump point. Next one, Windows MS-HTML platform security feature bypass vulnerability. Again, I knew this, but did some more digging. Now, an attacker would have to convince a user to load something onto their PC, maybe an email or just a link. This can happen, but hopefully it doesn't happen to you. This is a vulnerability which is weaponized. Now, MS-HTML is actually a software component which renders web pages onto the screen. So we're talking about two vulnerabilities now that's quite similar described. And with the Google Chrome vulnerability, I think they're all connected. Now, this particular vulnerability impacts every single device, because if you are using a browser, it doesn't actually just impact Edge or Internet Explorer. Is other software such as Outlook, Visual Studio, Skype, all uses the MS-HTML. You are unfortunately you have a vector to include this in your patch strategy urgently. It is also only important, as I mentioned, so we do need to make sure we look at more than just the vendor's own severity. This risk is across any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges at all. It does require user interaction. You've got to trick them into clicking a link. It can happen from time to time, but it doesn't have a jump point, which is great. And finally, another vulnerability I knew nothing about until I did this research, which is CVE 2024 30007, Microsoft Brokering File System Elevation of Privilege Vulnerability. What is Microsoft Brokering File System? Well, having done some research, this happens to be an application that is installed on a PC, isn't just given access to files on your drive automatically. It has to go through a brokering system. The software has to say, can I access that file? Am I privileged enough? Can I access a directory or a database on the PC? And actually, that is a decision that Windows is making with that application. And this particular vulnerability impacts that ability to make the decision. Now, in this case, a successful attacker could be performed from a low privilege app container. The attacker could elevate their privileges and execute code or access resources at a higher integrity level than that of the app container execution environment, i.e., it has a jump point. A jump point is a vulnerability that allows you to jump out of the vulnerability itself and into another technology. So in this case, it's from an app container and upwards. If it was a hypervisor for Hyper-V, then you might be able to jump from the guest to the host, from the host to the guest. If this is a vulnerability with the Edge browser, you might be able to jump from the Edge browser into Windows and vice versa. You may be familiar with this type of attack because it was used to exploit SolarWinds. So they actually were able to attack a SolarWinds vulnerability that was medium risk, actually jump out of that vulnerability into Windows, and they could leave breadcrumbs which they were able to then use to access that system after it had been exploited. Super serious, and that is my last recommendation for a strategy, is to consider the jump point as a vector to decide whether that makes it into your strategy or not. This particular vulnerability has a CVSS of 8.8, has no countermeasures. It does have a risk of a local attack vector, so you have to have local access to the device, low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction at all. Every other vulnerability is detailed down below, so even if you're not a Syxsense customer, go ahead and put this list in order. Take the CVE from here, pop it into the toolset, find out which of these are most exposed across your environment, and place those into a deployment for accelerated rollout, especially the two I recommended in this list above. Well, just want to say once again, I'd like to see you join me next week with Mary. We're really looking forward to running that additional webinar. Also, if you're interested in our third-party roundup, we have that also towards the end of the month. And I hope that today has been useful. And until next month, wish you happy patching. Thank you.